Hello, it's Tuesday, April the 21st, 2020, and this is another episode of Did You See That? A daily program for my class as we go through the Bible in a year, and where I pick out one element from our daily reading that just stood out to me for that day. And today we were looking at 2 Samuel chapters 1 through 4. And in this particular section, several things are happening. And of course, one element that is uh, happening that's very violent, of course, is the civil war between the forces behind Ishbosheth and, of course, those that are supporting David. So basically, the tribe of Judah against all the other tribes. It's a terrible civil war, and we see even elements within this few chapters of where those who've known each other and were respectful of each other were ending up killing each other, and which is the nature of civil war. Our own nation has known that, where even members of one's own family were fighting against each other. And so this is a terrible part, of course, in Israel's history. But the thing I wanted to point out again in this section is something that we touched on in an earlier portion of 1 Samuel, and that is the heart of David and in relation to his enemies in particular. And as we know, Saul, who was pursuing David to kill him, at the end of our of 1 Samuel's, we see that Saul and his son Jonathan are killed on Mount Gilboa. And as we saw these elements of the pursuit of David, this was a personal enemy of David. In other words, Saul was not out after a country or anything like that. He was after an individual, and that was David. So it was personal. And here we've already explained this when we looked at some of the Psalms, that David had put this into the Lord's hand. He was not going to raise his hand against Saul, who was the anointed of the Lord to rule over Israel as the first king. He was not going to do that, and he was not going to do that because he was not going to take vengeance personally on his enemy. And this is a distinction I think that we need to pay attention to here that helps us to understand even the words of Jesus when he comes to the Sermon on the Mount and talks about us loving our enemies and doing good to those who hate us, and even to those that despitefully use us even. And that is a personal response. That's our individual response. And it goes back to the Decalogue where it says, "Thou shalt not kill." And again, this is given to us from a personal motivational instruction that through the passion of vengeance and anger or what other passion there may be is not acceptable into killing or taking the life of another. Now, that is in contrast to the power that God has given to government. And that's where Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 13. Peter also covers this in one of his epistles, where God has given the sword to government to be his instrument of justice on the earth. And in that sense, the government is allowed to take a life in the name of justice. Now, naturally, there have been instances in history where governments have done just the opposite. They've taken life, but not in the name of justice, but in the name of whatever evil ideas they had to go forth with. And they are judged by that. God is judging them by that. But ideally, government is given the sword to perform justice on the earth. And in that sense, life can be taken. And we actually see examples of that in these first four chapters. First of all, the heart of David for him personally. Against Saul, when he learned of Saul's death and Jonathan's death. Of course, Jonathan was closer than a brother to him, and he loved Jonathan dearly. And there was a remorse there that was deeply felt from a personal level. But he also had personal feelings for Saul also, even though Saul was taking vengeance upon him or pursuing him um, unjustly. We saw many situations where David could have taken his life and did not, and showed that he had a genuine compassion for Saul even. And that is the heart that only the Spirit of God can give us, to love our enemies in that way, because he did indeed sincerely love Saul. And we see this in this first chapter of 2 Samuel, is that he mourned for him sincerely and wept for him. And so he had a sincere love for Saul and for his family. We see this in chapter 4, where he also mourned the death of Ishbosheth, which was the son of Saul that had been given kingship over the other tribes by Abner, or who called him into service, more or less. And in chapter 3, we see David's sense of personal devotion to man in chapter 3 toward Abner. Now, Abner was the commander of Ishbosheth's army, and during the Civil War, of course, was against David's forces. But when he came over to David, David received him graciously, even though Abner himself was not a righteous man. He did not have good intentions or good motives. Everything was done by him for his own gain, whether it be prestige, power, or whatever the case may be. And when that was questioned by Ishbosheth, he then turned on him and turned to David. But even still, David has a sense of devotion to his fellow man individually, so that even when Abner was killed, in the manner in which he was by Joab and Abishai, he had a genuine remorse for Abner. Now, those were instances where David exhibited the mandates that God has given us through his Spirit to love our enemies and to do good to those who hate us and to those who despitefully use us. And that can only come by the Spirit of God. In other words, if we try to muster those types of feelings or devotion to others from within ourselves, we may do so outwardly and make some motions towards that. But to have those genuine compassions is a thing of the Spirit of God. And therefore, if we are not experiencing that towards those that are around us, and we have animosity to personal individuals around us, then we need to submit that, confess that, of course, to God, and submit it to him to transform us and to transform our minds. And we need that. We need that transformation. I mean, even the disciples themselves needed that transformation. Remember how James and John asked Jesus if he wanted them to call down fire from heaven after a town did not receive their message. And of course, Jesus said to them, you do not know the spirit that you are of. And so we are all in need of that transforming power of the Spirit of God in us. David was far along in this aspect of his walk with God, because he had already submitted this area of his life to God. And we see the evidence of that in the way he behaved toward his personal enemies. That doesn't mean he was faultless by any means, because in these very same chapters, we see where he is accumulating unto himself even more wives while he was in Hebron. And then after he became the king in Jerusalem, he's going to even accumulate even more wives. And if I'm not mistaken, he had somewhere around 11 wives altogether. So, and that would be only one element there. And certainly the scriptures are not in any way trying to hide David's faults, for they bring them out quite bluntly to us in the scripture. But here, in his feelings toward his personal enemies, he shows great love and compassion. And we even see that in some of the Psalms that were attributed to him. But now there's a distinction here, because he also operates in the realm of government. He is the anointed king. He knows he is. and it has known that he was for ever since he was serving Saul, even playing the lyre in front of him to calm his nerves. He knew at that time already that he was going to be the future king. So now we see also in these very same chapters the sparing of his personal enemies, or his compassion towards them. And then we also see his taking up the sword in a governmental aspect. In other words, exhibiting justice where justice is duly deserved. The first instance was the Amalekite who came and reported Saul and Jonathan's death to David. And in that account, the Amalekite even confesses that he killed Saul at Saul's request, but he killed Saul. Now, if you go through the historical narrative in 1 Samuel, and then you come to this narrative by the Amalekite in 2 Samuel, you'll see that they don't jive with each other. And what is more than likely is that the Amalekite is using hyperbole in a great sense and lying in the most basic sense, and that he is saying that things happened in a way that they did not happen, and he takes credit for what he did not do. For instance, in 1 Samuel, we see that Saul fell upon his own sword and killed himself. More than likely, this Amalekite has just come upon the scene or even witnessed what occurred between Saul and his other servant, and Saul killed himself, and then of course the servant killed himself as well. And so he just comes upon it. He's an opportunist, and he takes up Saul's crown and his bracelet and runs to go to David in expectation of a reward, because he thinks, if I just tell him that I've killed Saul, then he will reward me. And of course, he doesn't get what he expects. He gets justice, because by his own testimony, David says, you have testified by yourself what you have done, and therefore your blood is on your own head. And there he exhibits the justice of government. That is, to take the life of another is heinous in the eyes of God when it is taken in the condition of the heart of revenge, or in this case, you may call it a mercy killing. Today we use the term euthanasia, is what we use today. But it is not up to us or any man to decide when one's life should culminate or come to an end. So that even suicide is a form of murder of oneself. And it is not up to us to decide when life should end, but it is only up to our Creator to make those determinations. And it is, as it says in the scripture, is appointed unto man once to die. It is appointed, and it goes on to tell us, even in the Psalms, how our steps are numbered, our days are numbered. They've all been laid out before God, before time immortal. So it is God who has determined our beginning. It is God who has determined our end. And for us to take it upon ourselves to say, this is what I will do, is a tremendous sin. And there's where that principle of concurrence comes in, that we have to be aware of, that we have our agendas, God has his, and of course his come to pass, but he uses us to bring about his. So we see that the Amalekite faces the consequences of murder, but then we come to chapter 4, and we also see where Baanah and Rechab, the two brothers, who are two commanders, have killed Ishbosheth while he was in bed in his own house resting. And again, they cut the head off of Ishbosheth, bring it to David, and again, anticipation of a reward. And there again, they do not get what they expect. They get justice, because again, they have not taken this life in a matter of war, of nation against nation, or anything of that nature. It's not in a governmental sense in that respect, but they've taken it upon themselves in order to get personal gain from it. So again, it goes to personal motivation of the heart, and they pay the price as well, and David exhibits judgment unto them. So I guess the only point I would want you to glean from this is to look at these contrasts, and because we have to reconcile these contrasts. I mean, uh, the scriptures do not contradict themselves, but if it seems like there's a contradiction, it's because our understanding of them is not in line. So when we understand that God has given us as personal individuals mandates that we are to follow, but he's also given governments mandates that they should follow, we can understand then the elements of vengeance versus justice. And there is a distinction there, and God is just, and so he will exact justice, and that justice does require the life of an individual. And he was very plain on this from the very beginning when he said, in the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. That they had the death sentence put on them at that time, as we all have the death sentence on us who have sinned, and we all have sinned. The only way that that death sentence can be commuted from us is if it was paid by another, and that's where Jesus Christ, our propitiation, has paid the penalty of death for those who have put their trust in him. So there's where we need to place our hearts onto him for that. So anyway, that is what I gleaned from these first 4 chapters. I hope to see you again on Did You See That? Thank you.